Good afternoon, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our virtual launch of a book titled Social Grants, Challenging Reckless Lending in South Africa. It's a collaborative project between the Black Sash and the London School of Economics. And today we are really going to just look at this report, focus on some elements. But before I get to the brief of the launch, let me first just talk a little bit about the house rules. And so one of the house rules is to ensure that participants, that your cameras and your audio functions has been disabled. Please feel free to introduce yourself, making use of the Q&A chat. And please do share your name, the name of your organization and where you are based. If you have a question, please write your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and click send. The moderator and the speakers will either reply back to you via text or we will answer your question live. Also ensure that as a participant, if you'd like to make a comment on any of the other questions, please do so freely in the Q&A box. Just to say that if you have a comment, you can also write a reply to an existing question if you have any answers to the questions that were posed. Please feel free to live tweet and include at Black Sash, Sash, in your tweet, or share your comment on Facebook. It's Black with capital letters, Sash with the beginning as a capital letter, South Africa, and it's one word. So it's Black Sash South Africa. You can also access the research report on our website. And then the presentations of the speakers will be added onto the Black Sash website following the launch. So you would have access to all the documentation that we spoke about and to in this presentation. Let me just repeat the issue of the tweet. It's at Black Sash _ at Black Sash at Black _Sash, at Black _Sash. I hope you have now got that correct. Thank you. So let us begin the program or the topic that we will be covering today. So South Africa has a large social grant system meant to provide assistance to vulnerable individuals, including the elderly, the disabled, and children. These grants have, however, become the object of or collateral for debt. Grant recipients often need extra money for emergencies, unexpected expenses, but credit options available to them entail exploitative products and practices. This research report uses case studies to explore the ways in which grant recipients access credit in both formal and informal sectors with a series of recommendations. The report has been compiled by Professor Deborah James, who will speak shortly after this, from the London School of Economics, David Neves, who was at the University of the Western Cape, and Dr. Erin Tonkelson, who was also at the University of the Western Cape. The program will run as follows. We will have an introduction by Professor Deborah James, a presentation. That will then be followed by a presentation by Nobuzwe Mafokeng. And then we will have a presentation by Dr. Erin Tonkelson, followed by a presentation by the National Credit Regulator, and then questions and answers, and then we will close the session. So that's more or less the order that we will follow. So without further ado, let me then introduce Professor Deborah James. Deborah James is a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics. She previously lectured at Wits. She is the author of Money for Nothing, Indebtedness and Aspirations in South Africa, from the Stanford University Press. The book explores contradictory dynamics surrounding South Africa's national project of financial inclusion, which aims to extend credit to Black South Africans as a critical aspect of broad-based economic enfranchisement. It also captures the live experiences of death of those many millions of South Africa who attempt to improve their positions or merely sustain existing livelihoods in emerging economies. So without further ado, let me hand over to Deborah. Welcome, Deborah. Can you unmute yourself, Deborah?
Okay, can you guys see my PowerPoint or not?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you. Right.
Okay, thanks a lot, Lynette. It's great to be here. Just to give you a tiny bit of background, as Lynette said, I wrote this book, which should be coming up here. Okay, hold on a second, sorry. Yeah, so I wrote this book and it was published back in 2015. And since then, things have moved on quite swiftly. Sorry, I think I'm having trouble with my PowerPoint here. Yeah, so things have moved on quite swiftly from that time onwards. What I discovered in the book is roughly as Lynette said, people need to borrow, they also want to borrow, and their need unfortunately puts them into the hands of unscrupulous operators. And so there's a kind of arms race that goes on between debtors trying to escape from creditors and creditors still chasing those debtors. And ultimately what was originally planned as some kind of a project of financial inclusion, which was intended to enable the poor by banking the unbanked, instead in many cases simply enables the smooth and easy transfer of money out of their bank accounts and into the hands of creditors. So my book, you know, as originally written, was undertaken in quite a lot of collaboration with the Black Sash. Discovered that they'd done a whole lot of interesting work on this long ago, in addition to what they're doing now. And when I became aware of the involvement of the Black Sash in the latest installment in this set of episodes via their program called Hands Off Our Grants, they and I entered into a collaborative arrangement together to try and find out more about how things had developed in the interim. So with funding from the LSE, we conducted research over 2 years, and that resulted in the publication of this report. Okay, so let me see, so just hold on a second. Yeah, so sorry, I'm just going to share again. I seem to be missing something here. Okay, so my book then I was taking further my interest in this topic together with the Black Sash, and looking at the timeline which comes up in the report, we'll see that specifically during the apartheid years, Black people were excluded from getting credit. But what we really wanted to find out about particularly was what happened after SASSA signed the controversial contract with CPS, which many of you will be aware of. That is the moment when many of those previously unbanked were financially included, and then later when the post office took over the responsibility for distributing grants. We wanted to find out in a whole variety of villages, settlements, and townships around the country. And now, if you look at how far-flung the settings on the map, which you'll see in the book, are, you'll realize how valuable it was to us to do research together with the Black Sash partner organizations around the country. And this is also my chance to say thank you to the Black Sash staff who've been so central in getting this report published. Not only the Black Star staff themselves, but also those partner organizations right around the country. Now, before I hand back to Lynette, I just want to give you one little sneak preview, a kind of spoiler alert. One of the key things we found out in this research is that instead of being a matter of either or, either lenders use the formal lender, either borrowers use the formal kind of electronic file transfer or debit order based lenders, on the one hand, like the infamous CPS, or they use the cash-based lenders commonly known as mashonisas. What we've actually found is that grant recipients around the country are relying on both. And given that people are extending rather than slimming down their borrowing, and given that some lenders are actually taking very little risk because the collateral here is a steady stream of income from the government via the grants, we want at the very least to see fair rates of interest and for people to be accurately informed of what those rates of interest are. As Stefan van der Merwe at the Stellenbosch University Law Clinic once said to me, the key question here is how much money legally can be taken and whose responsibility is it legally to check on this? The answers to this remain unclear, but we hope our report goes some way towards refining at least the question. Thank you very much.
You're still
Thank
muted.
you. Thank you. It gives me great pleasure, as always, to work with you, Deborah, and the London School of Economics. It's really been a joy in terms of this particular project. I would like, the Black Sash has many, many long-term partnerships. And many of those partnerships are with people on the ground. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Nobuzwe Mafokeng. She is a veteran activist and is the director of the Interchurch Local Development Agency called ILDA, a community-based advice office, and has been with ILDA since its inception many, many moons ago. ILDA's core casework includes unfair dismissals, farm worker rights, and assistance with immediate community and advocacy initiatives to hold officials to account. And Nobuzwe has been working with us over many, many years, also serve on the recourse forum with SASSA to register complaints and to talk about systems. So Nobuzwe, please tell us about your experiences on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. On our mapping exercise of free cash loans in Utenig with Black Sash, we found out that Utenig is a hub of cash loan businesses. For unknown reason, people are coming from other provinces just to open cash loans in Utenig. We also find that there are cash loans who are charging an interest of more than 100%. My presentation is about experience on reckless lending of SASSA grants beneficiary and unscrupulous cash loans in Utenig. The first case will illustrate 3 cases of indebtedness. The first case scenario is indebtedness about reckless lending. A child support and foster care recipient that is desperate to make ends meet. She went to almost every cash loan in Utenig in different times. She was approved to all loans. She has had children and foster children. She was also looking of foster children which were before on a Model C school, which was impossible to change them to other school, public schools, because they won't cope. She was drawing the grant from the bank. When the stop orders of the loan went through, she will reverse all of them because there was no money left in the bank account. She did this out of desperation to survive. The consequences of that, the cash loans could hand over for unpaid debts to lawyers, which she can lose her furniture and her house will be sold and they will be homeless. The question I ask here, were these cash loans doing credit checks before approving loans, so many loans? And were they looking at the law, which says there's no loan against child grants, but she was approved for more than 5 loans? The second case is about an old age recipient that borrowed 1.5. She was paying the loan through a debit order. She finished paying the loan, but the debit order continues deducting money from her bank account. There were times that there were double deduction for the same loan in the same month. She will go to the cash loan to inquire about the double deductions, and the cash loan will reimburse her and instructed her to sign for the reimbursement, not her knowing that she was signing for a further loan, which was said to her as a reimbursement and added to her balance. I and Blackshire staff went to the cash loan with her after bringing all the evidence. Our evidence was that the bank statement shows the double deductions. The dates of the cash loans were the same date of the double deduction, and the amount she was loaned was the same amount which was supposed to be refunded. The client was refunded the money. I think Erlen was there. While we were still in the cash loan, one of the cash loan employee instructed the client to sign for the reimbursement money. I intervened and I request to see the document she was about to sign. And I found out that she was signing for the further loan for the amount she was refunded on that day. In all loans she was given by the cash loan, there was no contract signed. It's only a paper and a signature of money received. And that case shows how people are getting in a debt cycle, not knowing by this unscrupulous cash loans business. The third scenario is also an old age pensioner who borrowed 1,200. She came to our office to complain that the deduction was still continuing while she paid up the loan. We lodged an inquiry with the cash loan company that promised us to call us back. They never called. About 15:45, I called the cash loan and the employee said she was coming to the office. Stupidly, she brought a copy of all the loans and date that the grant beneficiary supposed to have received. It was a dirty fabricated document. There was no contract. On one transaction, the balance was 5,000, but there was a further loan done on 2,000. On top of that, plus minus 5,000, that loan was approved according to them. According to the client, she knew that she borrowed 1.5 and denied all other amounts that reflected in the document. The cash loan employee insisted that the woman did borrow the money. We had a heated discussion and nobody was winning. I demanded proof that to request the municipal footage on those days or clip of the Caledon Street, because Caledon Street is a big street in Utenig. Those days that the woman was supposed to go and loan. That was going to assist me to identify the woman in the photo footage if she went to that cash loan on that day. I indicated that would mean that I report, if it's proven that the woman did not go and not appear in any footage on those days, I will report the cash loans to the National Credit Regulator for fraud. Surprisingly, he asked me to calculate all the money that was fraudulently deducted from the client's bank accounts. The cash loan went to draw the money and pay the client. Yes, there are grant beneficiaries that are trapped in debt because they are struggling to make ends meet. However, there are some beneficiaries that are trapped in debt cycle because of the deeds of these unscrupulous cash loans who are overcharging clients and who do not comply to the National Credit Act. For me, it seems that it's a get-rich scheme for them from the pensioners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nobuzwe, for that incredibly insightful examples of people getting themselves into debt and the kinds of terrible practices, credit practices and products that happen. I am now going to ask Dr. Erin Tolkinson to present to us the report. She is using a slide presentation, but before she does that, let me introduce her. She is Dr. Erin Tolkinson, recently graduated, is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the University of the Western Cape and a long time ally of the Black Sash. She completed a PhD thesis in geography from the University of California, Berkeley. And the title of her dissertation was Taken for Granted, Geographies of Death and Social Welfare in South Africa. Her research explores collusion between normative assumptions about cash transfer as a public good and the lived experiences of cash transfer as private debts. Erin, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just move the video box. There we go. Hi, thanks Lynette for the introduction, and thanks Nobuzwe for those fantastic case studies. That makes my job a lot easier. First off, so I just want to show you a little bit about where we conducted this research. As Deborah mentioned, we conducted the research all over the country. So the little purple dots are where in 4 partner offices of the Black Sash and 9 partner organizations. And we interviewed about 10 to 15 people in each site. And the case studies we got, as Nobuzwe shared, aimed to show the structural issues of indebtedness. And we did this between 2018 and 2019. So this is a world pre-COVID. All right. So I've been a friend and ally of the Black Sash since about 2016. And at that time, we didn't yet associate social grants and credit markets as strongly as we do today. But for me, there was one day I was in Delft sitting with a grant recipient and she told me, you know, I didn't know about this credit thing until I got my grant. And that really drove something home for me. That now all of a sudden grantees can access credit in a way they never had before. Not all credit, obviously they could have got informal credit, but they could access formal credit in a different sort of way. And I suppose this project has been devoted to understanding the structural implications of this quote, of what this grantee was saying in Delft. So to back up a little bit, Deborah told us about how her book traced the move from credit apartheid to the so-called democratization of credit in South Africa in the post-apartheid period. But even still, that credit hadn't reached people like social grantees. It reached Black government employees, teachers, nurses, those with secure incomes. But what is a grant? Well, that is a very secure income. So the CPS contract is what really accelerated the delivery of more formal sources of credit to poor people. And the CPS SASA contract, just to review, what ran from 2012 to 2018, it registered 18 million beneficiaries. It opened 10.5 million actually Grindrod bank accounts for recipients. Net1 and CPS collected biometric, personal, and financial data on all beneficiaries and recipients. And their subsidiaries were able to use that data to market financial products to those people. So CPS and Net1 and Moneyline used the social grant as collateral. The CPS system ensured that beneficiaries could not default on the loans that they took. But a lesson really commonly known. We all kind of get that. But a lesser known story is that this was not just CPS Net1 and their affiliates who were benefiting from this. The CPS Net1 payment system enabled the expansion of the lending market to entities. The big five banks actually stayed out of this market. For the most part, they weren't the ones offering credit. But cash lenders, payday lenders, one-time lenders, Chinese lenders, even mashonisas who formalized, all sprung up in taxi ranks and strip malls and places where social grantees would get their grants. And they benefited from the CPS Net1 payment system too, and the collateralization of grants. The contract came to an end, but these guys are still operating in the space. And Nabuzwe, this is her town, Uitenhage, we actually mapped all of the lenders that were around the social grant pay points. So the yellow dots, you can see the one yellow dot is the SASA pay point, and the other yellow dot is Nabuzwe's office, ILDA, right there in the center of town. And the green dots are all the unregistered lenders that have really sprung up since the SASA contract, and the blue dots are the registered lenders. So you can see very much how they're concentrated around the pay point. So this is what this grantee from Delft was really trying to tell me and tell us, was that there was a very big change in the types of credit that grantees could access because of their grant. Now, part of this goes back to the misalignment of some of the legislation around the Social Grant or Social Assistance Act and the National Credit Act. The National Credit Act was born of the desire to democratize credit, to bring Black people into credit markets. It's based in the language of equality. It seems like a good aspirational document. The Social Assistance Act, also good, says that grants need to go to the grantee. They can't be transferred, ceded, pledged, or in any other way encumbered or disposed of. But somehow these two bits of legislation don't align, and that's what Black Sash paralegals kept finding out. So numerous cases tried to protect grant beneficiaries from the types of activity that Nabuzwe was documenting, including the social assistance regulations, which stopped deductions on children's and temporary grant, and the Net1 case where the Supreme Court of Appeals said that the country needed to protect grantees from vendors and corrupt activities by employees of service providers. So all of those things led, of course, to our new payment system and the new reality that we find ourselves in now, which is under the post office. 18 million people have a SAPO SDA account. Sorry, that was 8 million people have a SAPO SDA account. 3 million people use other banks. Of those, about 800,000 still use the Net1 Grindrod account or the Easy Pay account or the green card. That's what that is all referring to. But what we found here, despite this change, and this is our first finding, is that what CPS set up, the ability for grantees to access loans from this entire new lending market, continues even under the post office system. Not necessarily for those with the SAPO SDA account, they still borrow, but they're pushed back into the informal system in cash. But those who use banks and Easy Pay cards are still predated upon by these kind of cash lenders and people working in this space. So we tend to celebrate this transition from what we see as exploitative, informal lending practices available to poor people, what we commonly call mashonisas or loan sharks, to formal, allegedly less exploitative lending practices, things like Easy Pay. But in such a binary, it's easy to view lenders like Easy Pay as better alternatives to these abusive practices. And many of the people we interviewed did prefer Easy Pay under certain conditions. But to say that a lender like Easy Pay is better or worse than a more informal lender is to miss the fact that Easy Pay, through the CPS SASA contract, actually created this entire market of exploitation. So to let them off the hook is a little premature because they've been handed this market on a plate. So our first finding is that lending to grantees, the system CPS Net 1 brought into being, continues even under the new payment system. Now, part of our report, we talk about why people borrow. I'm not really going to go into this because it was all the usual reasons: poverty, emergencies, consumption, health, education, funerals. Much of this has to do with other inadequacies in South Africa's social protection framework. So people who get sick and need transport to the hospital or need to pay for a private doctor. We found that lending is often cyclical. Many of the people that we interviewed, particularly those on child support grants, lend in or borrow money in December for Christmas and in June for winter clothes. And this leads to our second finding, that despite legislation, lending continues on all grants, not just larger grants, but even child support and temporary grants, which has been declared unlawful. Now, finding 3. We found that there are 3 main lender types that are working to get a clientele from social grantees. And we decided that instead of using the usual labels, we would come up with labels or names for these things that focused on their practices and not just on kind of stereotypes. So when I say practices, what I mean is how money is paid into a person's account and then how it is taken back or repaid to the lender. So we found 3 types of lenders using 3 different payment practices. The first worked entirely within the banking system. So they put money into an account using an EFT, and they took money out using a debit order. That's things like Easy Pay. It's very high tech. They often use biometrics. And again, it's entirely within the banking system. The second one is a hybrid. They give money in cash, but they take money back by debit order. So it merges both high tech, the debit order function, with kind of relational cash functions. And they often rely on handwritten or verbal contracts, but sometimes more formal contracts. And some of these are even registered with the NCR. The third is cash. So people give money in cash and they take money in cash. This is personalized. It often relies on ATM, bank cards, claim the repayment. It's not in the banking system. They're not using any sort of automated deductions to get money back. So actually the lender in this case bears more of the risk than in the EFT debit order or the cash debit order typologies. So overall, when looking at this chart, if you look from left to right, you can see it moves from formal to informal, and the interest moves from least to highest, and it moves from least exploitative to most exploitative. Or so we think. And I guess kind of our third major point in this report is that customary ways of understanding this, that least to most exploitative, least to most interest, don't actually encapsulate what we were finding on the ground and what people were saying. So often people preferred the Mashonisas or the loan sharks, what we're calling cash lenders, because they could borrow money at times when other lenders weren't available, because there was a social relation, particularly if this person was your neighbor, you could get a flexible repayment plan. Now, sure, many Mashonisas are exploitative and violent and horrible, but we had to figure out a way of accounting for the times when people chose something that didn't seem on the surface to make sense. And the lived reality was actually so that something that we would think was so much worse was actually better for this person in this moment. It also told us a lot more about how people took multiple loans in the formal and the informal system. and how in each of these categories, it's not just that this one's the least exploitative and this one's the most exploitative. Within each category, there's a range of so some of the machonistas were less exploitative, some were much more. Some of the cash debit order lenders were less exploitative, some were much more, even so, than machonistas. So to understand their practices gets away from kind of harmful stereotypes that we have and preconceived notions in our mind. So very quickly, let me go through a few case studies. All the names that I'm going to use in here are changed. A lot has been said about EasyPay, so I'm not going to say too much, but in our Hammond's Crawl case study, EasyPay formerly operated from a site close to the village of pensioner couple Abraham and Josephine. Since the SAPO changeover, Abraham and Josephine stuck with their green card in order to continue borrowing from Moneyline. They receive old age pensions and have borrowing regularly at Moneyline for the last 4 years. They began borrowing 500 Rand at a time and now a bit over 1,500. The loan officers have never done an affordability check where they actually asked the couple what they could afford, but they printed generic approximate assessments of household costs that were recorded on a mini statement. The pensioners brought their ID card and EasyPay card and, quote, put their thumb on the machine, which we know means Net1's biometric system. So the issues here that we found was that despite the interest being relatively low on EasyPay loans, there is a very low risk of default. But when you calculate the effective interest, EasyPay says they don't charge interest, they just charge service fees. But we're going to call all interest, service, and initiation fees effective interest, because those are the costs of the credit. And so this loan falls into the NCR category of unsecured credit. And under unsecured credit, we found two problems with the fact that these loans fell into that category. The first was that these loans really aren't unsecured because the government payment stream is so reliable and the banking system is so reliable that there's very little possibility of that lender not getting paid. But they're still priced as if they're unsecured and risky loans. And then also within this category of unsecured credit, grantees are disadvantaged. I'm not going to explain the math here. I have the chart here. The math is explained more in the report. You can go into it there. But this category extends from 1,000 Rand to 8,000 Rand loans. Grantees usually get a loan of about 1,000 or 1,500 Rand on the lower end. So on the lower end of this spectrum, the effective interest, service fees, initiation fees, can be up to 75% of the cost of the loan. Whereas on the upper end, it's only 44%. So even within this category, social grantees are specifically disadvantaged. So this was our next finding. When grants are collateralized by an EFT debit order lender, they should not be considered as unsecured credit or risky. They should be priced differently, more along the lines of a home mortgage. Okay, next one, cash debit order. Pumza in Uitenhage had a loan from Zhang Cash. Actually, Nabuzwe also talked about this person as well, though with a different lender. So at Zhang, Pumza told us 2 or 3 people work behind the bars at a service counter and a Chinese man, perhaps called Zhang, works in the back, though no one actually knows his name. Zhang Cash Loans is registered with the NCR, but it's engaged in all sorts of bad practices. They never gave Pumza a contract or any formal documentation for her loan. They just told us that the documentation, all she needs is in the window. And so there's signs like these in lenders across the country. It's not a great picture. There's reflection on the glass, but that's where the loan contract effectively lies. So Pumza borrowed 500 from Zhang and he gave it to her in cash. And the sign says he would deduct 625 all at once from her account. Again, I'm not going to do the math, it's in the report, but if you break out the interest and fees, service fees and initiation fees, this extra 125 Rand is allowable under the NCR credit rules about unsecured credit, even though it feels really high. So Phumza's bank statement reveals that Zhang didn't even stick to these already high credit terms. In fact, he deducted 1,000 Rand over 2 months in multiple deductions and multiple of the same deductions. Phumza told us about Zhang's way of working in this way. She said, Zhang is the worst. Zhang gave you this amount and then he took it all, the whole amount the next month. After that, you have to borrow again because you're already starting out 625 Rand, or in her case, 1,000 Rand in the hole. So when Phumza noticed that her money was short, that he had deducted more than he said, she brought her till slips to Zhang to complain. The staff assumed she was there to take another loan. She told the staff, no, I don't want it. I'm finished now. I want a letter saying I'm finished here. But Zhang gave her a letter. Zhang did give her this letter saying she was finished her paying, but he would not refund her money. Phumza told us that most other people in her situation actually just end up taking another loan because they can't negotiate for themselves because they didn't have Nabuzwe standing right next to them. So what are the issues here? Well, in these cash debit order loans, sometimes these businesses are registered, sometimes they're not. They all demand that you have an easy pay card or a bank card to borrow money so that they can deduct those repayments in cash, or sorry, automatically through the banking space. You give in cash and you take in debit. But this is a problem because then the beneficiary or the social grantee doesn't have a record within the banking system of that entire loan. Because that person, that lending agent gave them that loan in cash, they don't have a record of how much they actually got. So when they're trying to fight the system, the lender can just say, oh, you got X amount of money. And so that's why we deducted this other thing. Very often there's issues with not doing contracts or affordability tests, very high, though sometimes legal interest. Many of these firms use the same lawyer who figured out what conditions are barely legal and they stick to those very high terms and conditions. And even as Phumza's case shows us, even these very high rates of interest aren't always abided. There's rampant fraud in this market and double deductions and more deductions than you think you're going to have. And there's very little opportunity for recourse or getting your money back because the burden is on the beneficiary to negotiate for themselves. It seems like the multiple deductions are done explicitly to force people to take another loan the next month and not to have a cooling off period between loans. So this brings us to finding 5, which is that cash debit order lenders, even those registered with NCR, regularly engage in very exploitative practices. Now, our final is cash. So Patricia is a member of a stokvel. She needed a loan. She was advised by her fellow members to approach a neighbor known to offer loans who belonged to another stokvel. And that neighbor's stokvel encouraged stokvel members to lend out their money. Patricia wanted to borrow 3,000 and she said, I called this neighbor to come to my house. It was too far for me to walk. The normal practice would have been for Patricia to repay almost 4,000 the following month, a 30% interest rate, but she negotiated and asked if she could stretch the payment over 3 months without extra interest on top. The lender agreed. Instead of keeping Patricia's card, this lender came to get her card every month at the end of the month. She trusts me, she knows where I live, is what Patricia said. So the lender would withdraw what was owed to her and then give Patricia the bank statement, which is pictured here. So Patricia could see exactly what had been taken. Patricia was very happy with this. She said, that one was very good. She didn't cheat you. So, of course, this is a positive example of what we call a mashonisa. Many are much more exploitative. There's a range, and that's what we found. Often those closest to people, like those who are members of stokvels or neighbors who lend out money, are the least exploitative. and those that are further, maybe in a slightly larger regional town, are more exploitative and charge higher rates of interest. Because the cash lenders don't use the banking system, the lender in this case bears much more risk. That's why some of them keep cards. But we found that actually there was a whole gradation of lenders. Some don't keep cards at all, as in Patricia's case. Some keep the card, but the grantee keeps their own PIN number, so they have to go together to the ATM. And some keep both cards and PINs. And obviously that's the most exploitative, and where machonistas like the one in Howick could have 428 cards and just deduct the entire social grant every month. The interest could be as low as 25%, which is more in line actually with some of those cash debit order businesses, and is vaguely almost legal if you break out initiation and service fees, or as much as 100% per month, which is not so far off the cash debit order system. And often people like these because there's a flexible repayment period and they can negotiate. Of course, there's also terribly exploitative and violent ones. So finding number 6 was that there's a huge range of what we generally call machonistas, and not all are equally exploitative. Now I have just 2 more slides, so I'm almost done, but in sum, one of our interesting findings was that people didn't necessarily get mad when the interest rate was very high. They got mad when there was a violation of what they felt they had agreed to, a violation of customary practice. That's when people would take action. And there weren't very many ways available for people to take action against these sorts of fraudulent debts. There was austerity, basically metabolizing the cost of the debt by consuming less the next month. A grant recipient from Kutzong told us that, I told my kids I'm getting out of here because every time I borrow money, month end, I'm supposed to pay back. The more I go there, the more I'm going deeper and deeper. I told my kids this month, you'll stay hungry because there's no money. And she said, I haven't gone back there till now. So that's one way. You have to get out of your debt just by consuming less. Another way, in Hammondscrawl, there's a lot of documentation by the Black Sash of beneficiaries who would either fight the machonistas or hide. So social lenders would stand at the gates of the grant pay point and disturb those in the queue, waiting for people to come out so they could grab them. There are some grant recipients who are stronger than the machonistas, and they would fight them. They would say, if you take our money, if you take our card, we'll fight you. And others would wait behind the office until the lenders left. A third way of fighting back was, of course, the opportunity to change accounts when the post office system came in. So in Delft, that Hope for Destiny, the leader there helped 5 people close their accounts and transition to the SAPO card, where those lenders couldn't take their money anymore. So our finding number 7 was that if these are the only ways people have to get recourse, this isn't enough. And we need much better systems of credit-related education, advice, and recourse for social grant beneficiaries as this lending market continues to expand. Now, I'm going to stop here and we can move on. But these were our recommendations, which I hope we get to talk about more in the question and answer period. We've organized them into legislation, implementation, and education. And yes, thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to discussing this further.
Erin, can you please just take us through the recommendations, because I think it's very important. Okay, and there is just a little bit more time.
Okay, there's always just a little bit more time.
Thank you. Yeah.
So our legislative recommendations are to align the Social Assistance Act, the SASA Act, and the National Credit Act, to ban lending by SASA contracted parties, so like CPS, so we never got into that situation again. Ban lending on children's and temporary grants, which has been done, but that needs to be enforced, and reassess risk on permanent adult grants so that the rates at which grantees are being lent money aren't so ridiculously high, because it is very low risk when you're operating in a banking environment. The second one, enforcement. We want there to be a fund for debt counseling for grantees, free debt counseling for grantees. We want to build the NCR capacity to enforce existing legislation. And we want to establish a hotline or a police unit for hotline and police unit for lending specific crimes. As for education, develop simple education materials about debt and borrowing for social grantees. Build the capacity of NGOs and CBOs to work with the NCR to bring these cases to them, and to build a financial literacy curriculum for schools. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you, Erin. That was a great presentation and a lot to chew on. I am now going to turn my gaze to the National Credit Regulator to give some response. We did have one meeting where we presented some of the findings to them, but today they will get their teeth into the report by just responding to some of the elements. The National Credit Regulator, or the NCR as it's called, was established as regulator under the National Credit Act of 2005, and is responsible for the regulation of South Africa's credit industry. Its task is to carry out education, research, policy development, registration of industry participants, investigations of complaints, and ensure the enforcement of the Act. The Act ensures that the regulator promotes the development of accessible credit market, particularly to address the needs of historically disadvantaged persons, low-income persons, and remote, isolated, and low density areas. So there are three of them working together. There's Bongani Gweke. I hope I'm pronouncing it okay. Bongani is the supervisor of stats and research departments at the National Credit Regulator. He's been with the organization for the past 9 years, previously worked in different South African top banks. He has previously approved credit applications and currently is monitoring trends of the approved credit applications. Lebogang Selebe. Lebogang is currently working as supervisor in Education and Communication Department at the NCR. One of her roles is to assist with the management of the department. She's passionate about consumer education and communication. She has a diploma in public relations, a practical project management certificate from UNISA's business school, and she has a BA honors in media studies from the University of South Africa. And then there is Liseba Mashepa, who is the company secretary, and he didn't give us a description of all his accolades, but welcome. So we are putting the NCR, they do have a presentation. Thank you. Bongani, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm here. I'm just sharing my screen. Okay, I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
If you can show us one slide. There we go.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks for inviting us to your presentation. I'm here representing National Credit Regulator, but our focus will be mainly on the statistics that we receive. As the National Credit Regulator, according to the Act, we're supposed to collate information from registered credit providers and also from credit bureaus. If I may just explain quickly, credit bureaus, credit providers, they grant credit and then give that information to credit bureaus to update if a person is paying on time or is paying late and all of that. So the stats that I will provide now, although our stats is slightly behind the December stats, but stats in general doesn't change much. Whatever we will be sharing with you today will still be relevant even going forward. Okay, now getting to my presentation. As a national credit regulator, we have different types of registrants. As I said, we've got about 7,000 credit providers of different sizes, because for example, your banks, your retailers, your motor vehicle finance, your mortgage financiers, and also your micro lenders, which I think your research is mainly focusing on your micro lenders. But our statistics is for everybody. Then we've got payment distribution agencies. Those, they collect money from debt cancellers and pay to credit providers. We've got about 1.6 debt cancellers. The debt cancellers, they assist people who are unable to meet their payment requirements. If you feel like you are stressed, your monthly payments are more than what you can afford, then you are encouraged to talk to a debt counselor who will assist, and then they will collect money. Money will be collected by payment distributing agencies to pay to credit providers. Then we've got about 44 registered credit bureaus. But most credit bureaus have got about 6 hosting, we call them hosting. Those ones, for example, if you need your credit report, you can talk to them. The rest are mainly your resellers. They buy information from the hosting credit bureaus to use it for certain purposes, or like rentals and all of those different things. Now, as I said, we receive information from credit bureaus. This slide I have here will show that the number of credit active consumers. That means people who got some kind of a credit record at the bureaus. We've got about 25 million, sorry, the thing is jumped. We've got about 25 million of those consumers that have some type of credit. Okay. Sorry, just a second for me. This thing is giving me trouble. Yes. Sorry, I was just trying to minimize screen. Some areas were hidden. I hope you can still see it. Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, out of 25 million credit active consumers, 57% of those are in good standing. When we say good standing, basically we mean they pay their debts on time.
Sitting every day.
Sorry? Oh,
continue.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Continue.
Okay, thank you. They pay their debts on time, and then about 42.5% of those, unfortunately, which are about 10.7 million consumers, they are delayed. They don't pay on time due to different reasons. It's either some they skip because they are struggling to meet their monthly repayments. So for us as a national credit regulator, we would prefer to have 0 impairments, but the reality, due to different circumstances, some people don't pay on time. Some, they have arrangements. For example, they would be paying on the 15th instead of paying on the 7th. So all of those things, they will be considered as impaired. So it's about 42% of people who are impaired. Okay, now we said we have 25 million credit active accounts, consumers. Those consumers, they've got about 82 million credit active accounts. But now the picture here changes slightly. 73% of those consumers, they pay their debts, their accounts on time. Then the difference between consumers and accounts. Consumers, you are listed at your worst position. For example, a consumer will have 7 accounts. They pay their account, 6 of them on time. They pay 1 late. That consumer will be classified as impaired. That's why when you come to accounts, you can see that majority of accounts are paid on time, which is 73%, because each account is charged on its own unlike a consumer who's charged based on their entire portfolio. So on accounts, generally, the picture looks much better because about 27% of consumers are impaired, but majority of consumers, 73, are paying their debts on time, which is a good picture. Now we move to credit providers' data. Credit providers, they give credit in terms of mortgages, which is your housing and your land, and then secured credit, which is mainly a furniture and vehicle finance. And then credit facilities, which is dominated by your store card, your credit card, and overdraft. Anything that is revolving in nature will be under credit facilities. Your unsecured credit, which is mainly covered by the research that was presented. And then your short-term credit. Short-term credit is anything up to 8,000, repayable within 6 months. That one is classified as short-term credit. And then developmental credit is mainly your student card or your taxi financing. People who do small businesses, they will mainly fall under developmental credit. But this slide is showing us that at the beginning in 2007, when the National Credit Regulator started collecting stats on the credit that is granted by the industry, 51% of data of new credit that was granted was mainly mortgage loans. And then 31% was the vehicle financing and or furniture, the ones that we call secured. But over the years, the two graphs have switched sides. Now, most credit goes towards vehicle financing. There are multiple reasons for that. There's a majority of the market. Now, a lot of people, they've got houses, and so now they're moving to buy furniture, to buy cars, because of maybe lack of public transport and all of that. But the two graphs have switched. The other thing that it draws attention there is the unsecured credit. If you look, you'll remember in 2012, unsecured credit was called a bubble, it shot up. And we know a few credit providers, banks were affected in that space. And then it came down slightly. Then it remained flat for a long time. But in the past few quarters, we see again, it's starting to tick up. A lot of credit providers are starting to offer unsecured credit again. And then short-term credit is almost disappearing. Okay. Now we move to the purpose of credit, why people take unsecured. The stats that we got is showing us that most people, they take unsecured to do renovations or to build houses, mainly in rural areas, because most institutions don't finance houses in rural areas because there's no title deed. That has allowed people in rural areas to build their own houses using unsecured loans, which that's more of a positive when you look at it. Instead of using for consumption, at least they are doing something that will benefit them in a long time. Then the second one will be your consolidation. They are consolidating their loans, meaning someone, instead of paying multiple loans, they feel like, no, it's better if I just got one debit order that goes off my account. That one is also legally allowed. Your other is mainly, unfortunately, which is the most, is more on the consumption side. People who take loans going on holiday or to buy food and all of that. Those are the three main dominating purposes of unsecured credit. Short-term credit is mainly for, unfortunately, for consumption. It's people who is almost like a bridge finance. People, they run out of money during the month, then they run and borrow just to cover so that they can finish their month, maybe to use for transport for that month or to buy food in order to close that gap. Developmental credit is mainly, previously was dominated by educational loans. Unfortunately, because of changes in government plans, NSFAS is mainly now, they offer bursaries. They don't grant loans anymore like they were doing before. So now that has shifted to small businesses. Your small business is mainly your taxi finance, as I said earlier. So most of developmental credit goes towards people who buy taxis or building spaza shops, like small type of a business. Okay, now here we're looking at, according to the NCR, 0 to 7.5, we consider those ones as low income earners, according to our act. So we looked at saying which of the low income earners take the most credit. Then we realized that no, the lower guys at the beginning, if you look there in 2011 up to 2014, the blue, which is 0 to 3.5, they were dominating unsecured. They were taking a lot of unsecured loans, but as time moves, you realize that the unsecured loans, guys who are trying to earn a little bit more are starting to dominate the unsecured space. They are taking more loans compared to those who earn lesser. The same picture on the credit facilities. Credit facilities is mainly dominated, as I said, by stock cards and credit cards and overdraft and all of that. But mostly what we see here, the guys who earn 0 to 3.5, they take a lot of credit facilities, which means they take a lot of store accounts. They open a lot of store accounts, and also a lot of entities, I'm sure we have seen even adverts and all of that, they're starting to market credit cards to low income earners. So that they are entering that space. That's why they mainly in the low income group, the 0 to 3.5 is still taking more of the credit facilities, your stock card and a credit card. Short-term credit is mainly taken by the two guys, which is 3.5 to 7.5. Those ones are the main guys who take a short-term credit, which for us, we find that slightly strange because you would assume the more you earn, you should be in a position to at least budget, be able to finish your month with your salary. But short-term is showing as a different picture to say, no. Actually, guys who earn much lesser, which is 3.5, those ones, they seem to manage their money. They can be a domestic worker. They can live within their means in most, that's what the picture is showing. But those who earn slightly higher, those ones, they seem to be, maybe they buy more nice things, we don't know, but they seem not to manage to budget properly. This is my last slide, just to show it's about 1.6 trillion of debtors book, people that they owe around the country. In no time, we predict that by end of next year will be above 2 trillion in the debtors book, the amount that is owed by people. But most of that goes towards mortgages, which is your housing, which that makes sense also because that space, loans, they take longer, 20 years, 30 years, depending on that, and followed by a vehicle financing, which is 6 years, 5 years, depending on that. Basically, that's a picture that we have in terms of credit that is granted to consumers. Thank you. Lebo, you can take over slide number 12.
Lebo, unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good day to everyone. So I'm going to take you through consumer education that we do as the National Credit Regulator. So we are responsible to educate consumers about the National Credit Act. We do it using different methods, such as your workshops, your exhibitions, your media interviews, etc. And we also educate educate consumers using advertising campaigns, such as using radio, television, your outdoor media like your billboards. We've now entered using social media and digital media as well. We are currently running a campaign educating consumers on the options available to them during the COVID-19, those who are battling to repay their debts. So I think probably as some of you have seen the campaign, it's running on social media, it's on radio, it's on television as well. And then with regards to our activities, our workshops, our exhibitions, a lot of them are at no cost. Actually, the majority, we don't charge consumers who want us to come and educate them. They are free of charge, and we travel to the respective areas, be it in the urban area, peri-urban, or even in the rural areas. We do them either by invitation from different stakeholders, or we self-initiate ourselves, partnering with your different stakeholders as well. So within these workshops and exhibitions, we cover different topics as covered in the National Credit Act, such as your consumer rights, responsibilities. We do your card retentions, over-indebtedness, debt counseling, credit bureaus, credit information, credit life insurance, and also we cover your deceptive and unfair business practices. So it will also depend on the stakeholder, what is it that they want us to really cover if they do have a preference. Bongani, please go to the next slide. Thank you. So with regards to the education that we've been doing, we've also partnered with a Credit Bureau Association where we are doing industrial theater for high school learners and your tertiary students. Basically, the industrial theater is focusing on topics such as your credit bureaus, your credit information, budgeting, and over-indebtedness. So we wanted to focus on this group and educate them, especially your high school learners, before they actually become credit active, and even with your tertiary students as well. If we can get them before they actually get credit active. So we've been doing that in partnership with your Credit Bureau Association, doing the industrial theater. We are also in partnership with your different tribal authorities around the country, mostly in rural and peri-urban areas where we focus. Mostly it's your pensioners and your grant recipients, where we educate them on different aspects of the Act. Obviously, we would focus on things like your credit life insurance, your consumer rights, card retention, and any deceptive and unfair practices within the National Credit Act. And because of COVID, we've also now resorted to also doing virtual presentations and WhatsApp presentations to stakeholders, as we have not been able to do face-to-face interactions. So this is what we are trying to do with regards to consumer education, so that we don't stop. Even if we cannot do face-to-face, we can still reach them using your virtual presentations. This is over and above the media interactions that we are currently doing. So in a nutshell, this is what the department is all about in terms of consumer education. Thank you.
Thank you, NCR, Lebogang and Bongani, for your informative presentation. I am now going to take some questions from the chat room, but also I want, there's just one or two questions to the NCR. We're first going to deal with the NCR presentations. I want to read them from here. Then I'm going to give Deborah James an opportunity to respond, and then I'm going to go back to the NCR to respond to the two questions that are in the question and answer. So there's two questions.
It's Lisiba Mashaba.
Welcome. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone.
Afternoon, Lisiba.
Welcome, and thank you very much. We know that you've been struggling to get on board with welcome.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
right,
I won't put up my video, but I just wanted to say a few things.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Questions, yeah. but I'm not putting up my video.
Okay, perfectly fine. Yeah. Continue.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I've had the panelists who have presented, and I believe that the issues that they are raising in their presentations are valid and they need to be attended to. But we have also taken a number of measures, especially the last 5 years, to address the problems of consumer over-indebtedness and the high cost of credit. We issued a specific regulation which determines the elements of an affordability assessment of a credit application, where, for example, living expenses, debt obligation, and the income of the consumer need to be validated before the loan is issued. And on the debt obligation, we included a specific requirement for all credit providers to check the credit record of the consumer at the credit bureaus. We also reduced interest rates on unsecured loans by 8% in 2016. And on short-term loans, the short-term loans are payday loans, loans of up to 6 months with a capital of not more than 8,000 rand. We reduced the interest rates there by 2% for the second loan in a calendar year. And then we also introduced a regulation which kept the premium of credit life insurance to 450 per 1,000 of credit. So all what I'm just saying is we have introduced new rules in order to try and stem the tide of consumer over-indebtedness and also to help reduce the cost of credit. But I see that what is happening in the countryside, it seems that people are ignoring these regulations, they are not following them. What I also liked about, especially the second panelist, was the recommendations that have been made. And I think it's very, very important that we have to try to work towards aligning the NCA, the National Credit Act, with social security legislation. Because currently, there is a debate whether we can use the NCA to say don't lend money to all consumers who are receiving social grants, and people say, but we are allowed under that, we are not prohibited by that legislation. And secondly, also to increase collaboration between the NCR, Black Sash, and other non-governmental organizations. And this will help us because we have only been created with one office in Gauteng to serve all the 9 provinces. And it's practically impossible to be in all 9 provinces at the same time. But if we start to develop partnerships and relationships, I think we can make some progress. So what I will appreciate is maybe Lynette or Huda can send us just a letter on the recommendations that were in the report that was presented, so that I can have a discussion with our management and the DTI to see which ones we can implement immediately. Thank you, Lynette.
Thank you so much, Riseba, for that comment. We will certainly take you up and write that letter to get some action and implementation on the recommendations. I'm going to give Deborah an opportunity to just respond to the NCR presentation, and then I'm going to take some questions from the chat.
Lynette, I'm sorry, I don't think we can hear you. Your volume seems to have dropped.
I'm not on mute. Can you hear me now?
No, you're too far. We can't hear you.
Okay.
Lynette, I think you might have touched the speaker of the laptop. Maybe if you can leave the laptop completely. Let's hear. We have lost audio completely, Lynn. Are there any earphones on the laptop? On.
Maybe I can I just go in and quickly give my response to the NCR, and if necessary, one of us can take over chairing. Does that sound okay?
Yes, I'll call Lynette separately now.
Okay. Yeah. So I just wanted to say a couple of words in response to the National Credit Registry presentation. I think what comes out from that is that our presentation was about a very particular type of lending. It's about a particular type of lending that has been tagged on to the existence of the social grants. In other words, it's taking social welfare as the basis of supposedly unsecured lending, but actually not unsecured lending, as we were trying to point out. I think that in the presentation, much of what was regarded as unsecured lending is in fact sort of, in a sense, at odds with what we were saying. And one of the things we are doing is rather kind of blurring the boundaries between so-called secured and so-called unsecured lending. I think the main point here is that social policy and social welfare is supposed to protect people from risk. Debt, on the other hand, is the opposite. It creates more instability and more risk and makes people more vulnerable. And much of what we were trying to point to, although it may represent a relatively small proportion of the lending book overall, i.e. it doesn't take any account of mortgages or vehicle finance, that's literally completely outside of our remit, it nonetheless is huge in moral terms. It means that the state is spending a large amount of money trying to keep people alive, and much of that money is going into the hands of these, frankly, egregious lenders. So whatever the proportion is, we feel that this is a very important thing to be taken account of. And also I feel that talking about this kind of stuff, people feeding themselves, for example, as consumption, gives a slightly misleading account, because in a sense, these people are not consuming. It sort of immediately raises notions of people driving flashy cars or having lovely holidays. These are people trying to literally survive. So I think that in a sense, the notion of consumption as the basis for this kind of credit is a slightly misleading one. And then finally, I would just say that we do in our research acknowledge that there's a very fine balance to be struck between regulation, i.e. offering no loans whatsoever, and liberalization, leaving the market completely open to all. And we don't feel we really know the answer to where that line must be drawn, but we feel it's something that, in a sense, our research has drawn attention to, which maybe even the National Credit Register doesn't quite recognize. It's those people completely under the radar, totally off in the margins, dependent on social welfare, that our research is drawing attention to. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Sorry, can you hear me now? Hello?
Hi, Lynette, your voice is very faint.
Okay, I think I'm going to ask somebody to take over the chair for a little bit until we sort this one out.
Now it's perfect. It's coming back, Lynette. I think you might have to. Yes, that's perfect.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. Okay, a moment of panic there, but let's continue. Right. So in the chat box, there's a question from David Woolan. And he is saying his question to the NCR and the DTI is, why is the NCR and the DTI not focusing on the microeconomic impact of the exponentially growing unsecured lending market and the negative impacts that this is having on the growing inequality in our society? How can we address the enormous imbalance of the past when such a high portion of consumers' income is being diverted to services, unproductive and very expensive debt? That's one of his questions. And the other one is, another question is, why is the NCR not publish the Credit Bureau Monitor, CBM, and the Consumer Credit Market Reports for the first and the second quarters of 2020, especially given the economic crisis we are facing? Can we put those two questions to the NCR? He's also got a third one, which is saying, I would challenge the purpose of unsecured data, the unsecured data, especially given that it is mostly provided on an unverified basis by borrowers at point of sale. And such a high percentage of loans was used for home building and improvements, we would have seen a boom in the building supply sector, but that is not the case. Those are the three questions that is in the question and answer section, and I'm going to move that to the NCR to respond.
Thank you, Lynette. I will answer the first question. I think Bongani will talk about the statistical reports. The question regarding unsecured lending is a very complex question. I think very difficult to resolve because in the early 2000s, government took deliberate steps to open up the credit market to people who were previously disadvantaged. And over time, there was such growth in credit, especially unsecured credit, to these communities that at some point, it posed a risk to the banking sector and the country. I think what we should do is not to try to reverse or cancel more regulations, but maybe to look at the cost of credit, the loan sizes, and the terms. And the other problem is growth in credit also could mean that you have more people who are taking unsecured loans for consumption mainly. And because of the racial inequalities that we have in the country currently, the lower income consumers mainly survive on short-term loans because the income they earn is so low that it is totally insufficient to meet the needs of their families. So it's a very, very complex situation because it's linked to the economic environment and our past history of racial discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought that Bongani was also going to make a response.
Yes, I was going to respond to the question of publishing CBM and CCMR.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, firstly, Q2, which is Q2, we are not late with that one. According to the Act, it should be published by the end of September. That one, we're not late. But Q1, that one is delayed due to the fact that there was a lockdown. A lot of credit providers were not operating. And also the regulator issued, in line with Regulation 3, gave all credit providers an extension in terms of submission because they were not operating anyway. So we didn't want to publish wishy-washy statistics which will exclude a lot of credit providers. So as I said, Q2 is still within, we're not late with that one because it's due by the end of September. I think also I will take the last question, which is talking about unsecured and housing or building houses. Based on what we have seen, and also the information we get from the credit providers, they submit, they fill on their form, there's a form called Form 39. They tell us in that form to say, what was the purpose of credit? What did the consumer say when they were applying? So we use that information. I'm not sure if maybe Dave has been around the country in rural areas in particular. What we have seen in rural areas, in particular when we do our workshops, and we ask people, they confirm that they took unsecured to build their own houses, which when you drive anywhere in rural areas in South Africa, you will see the amount of houses that have been built over the years, in particular from 2005 up until now. So from our point of view, we use information given by credit providers to us. And also when we do our workshops, we ask people what they do with these loans that they take, and they point, they say, no, I built my house with that money. So that's where we come from.
Thank you. Any of the panelists wanting to respond to these issues and questions? Research team, any one of you wanting to respond to the questions? Hello.
Hi.
Am I having...
I've got one point to make. It's not directly in relation to the question of the building boom, the alleged building boom, or the lack of the building boom, but it has got to do with the very peculiar nature of this particular credit sector that we're addressing, which once again I feel like maybe hasn't quite been addressed by the National Credit Register. It's got to do with the fact that these are not people who are having to be chased for debt. It's not people who are struggling to repay their debts. On the contrary, these are people who are having to are repaying their debt all too readily because it is being automatically taken away from them. I think that this is maybe something which conventional reports on the levels of indebtedness and the question of repayment don't necessarily quite address. This is not like the sort of scenario where, you know, somebody gets lent some money by somebody and then the debt gets sold on and then the debt collectors come and chase the person. Many of these debts are simply being paid in an automated fashion. And I feel that there's a sector out there, especially these cash debit order lenders, which we talked about in our report, which is not being addressed by any of these regulatory functions. They've all got these National Credit Register things stuck in their windows. But I feel strongly that it's very unlikely that there's anything really being done to address the way in which they're operating.
Perhaps I can also sort of jump in here just to think about some of the sort of policy dimensions of this. I think there's also a very specific need to address the question of effective interest rates. Many of these lenders say that they charge 0% interest, and strictly speaking, they're correct. But in fact, the effective interest rate is extremely high. For comparatively small amounts of money lent to impoverished borrowers. It's comparatively high because of the initiation fee and the monthly service fee. And I think there's this kind of bait and switch that sort of happens where because we've carved out this idea of interest versus fees, many of these lenders are making large profits at the expense of borrowers, but the returns are bundled in really high fees.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have come to the end of this session. I think I'm a minute or two over. But let me take this opportunity to thank you as the participants. I have been keeping watch there and saw that we've been quite stable throughout the process. So thank you very much to all the participants who have made the time to come and to this webinar. Thank you to our researchers. Once again, thank you to the London School of Economics for their contribution to this research. Thank you to the NCR for their enormous contribution to this conversation. And I hope that this will set the agenda for us engaging on these very, very important recommendations. And certainly that letter will come to you shortly, Liseba. And then just lastly, to thank our admin team who have worked relentlessly behind the scenes, Ashley, Koliwe, and also our important host, Ernest, who have kept us on charge and keeping the system stable and live streaming on Facebook. Thank you so much, everybody, for your enormous contribution. Stay well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Lynette.
Bye-bye.